I don't want to have a wasted meeting. I don't want to have a waste of time, so I'll see what happens. But we did all of these great deals, great peace deals. They're all peace deals. They're agreements, solid agreements, every one of them. But this one, and I said, go to the line of battle, on the battlefield lines, and you pull back and you go home, and everybody takes some time off because you got two countries that are killing each other.
Well, the two countries that President Donald Trump is referring to here are Russia and Ukraine, of course. He has essentially failed to end the war in Ukraine in the 24 hours that he promised when he was campaigning for president. Obviously, that was hyperbole, but he hasn't really made much progress at all. And to be quite frank, anyone following this story is having a difficult time following what Donald Trump's rationale is one day to the next. So let me give you the details and you can decide for yourselves. Now, the White House has decided to cancel the president's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin ahead of a planned summit in Budapest. Now, President Donald Trump has declared that the diplomatic talks would be a waste of time, as you just heard him say. I don't think it would be a waste of time if maybe the US government were sitting down with Russia in good faith to hear what their concerns are, because I do think they have one concern, and I haven't really heard much reporting on how or whether it's being addressed at all. Now, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, and Dmitry Lavrov, who is the foreign minister in Russia, are slated to meet in Malaysia later this month at a summit organized by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. However, senior officials in the Trump administration are now denying that there's any meeting scheduled at all. Officials said that Rubio and Lavrov will continue to engage with each other to map out plans for a possible Trump-Putin summit. So they're kind of sending mixed messages on whether or not they're even open to have conversations. But in addition to that, Cenk, there are two conflicting narratives in regard to what Russia wants or doesn't want. And I want to give you those two narratives in just a moment. But first, what do you make of Trump kind of going back and forth on whether he's hot on Russia, cold on Russia? Like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what he's actually planning to do, if he has a plan at all.
Yeah, so I've criticized how Trump has conducted these peace negotiations before. And if you remember, he weirdly got animated about Ukraine's mineral rights in the middle of a peace treaty that's so important to the world between the two different countries. He's like, oh, by the way, I interrupt this peace treaty to say I'm gonna hold Ukraine hostage to give us all their mineral rights, otherwise we won't help you with Russia. So that was unacceptable and weird, etc. But that's all in preview to, no, overall though, I'm gonna give Trump credit because he's clearly trying to get to peace here. Like, Israel's a way more confusing issue, right? And he's been way worse on that. It's not really a peace deal. It's really just giving Israel everything they want. But in this Ukraine, Russia, yeah, he's trying to go back and forth between the two parties, threatening both sides. In his mind, he's using leverage against both sides to get them to the table. Is that really going to work? Well, it hasn't worked so far. On the other hand, I like that the brother's trying, and I think on this one he actually is earnest. And if I'm wrong and naive about that, okay, it is what it is, and I'm happy to accept that judgment. But for now, that's how I see it. But also good news, Anna, later I will tell you, I have a peace plan that I think can work.
Of course. Okay, looking forward to that. Before we get to that though, so the two different narratives I'm talking about are as follows. Let's start with the first narrative. I think this is the widely accepted narrative here in the United States. But if you listen to, I guess, if you want to call them dissident voices on foreign policy, people like Jeffrey Sachs, who actually does want peace, the narrative is entirely different. So what is the narrative that's been accepted by the United States? Basically that the Trump administration claims that Russia has refused the ceasefire after the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, met with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and allegedly made clear that the Kremlin is absolutely committed to taking full control of the entire Donbas region as part of any settlement, something that Ukraine is not open to. And clearly, if this is true, this is something the US isn't open to, right? And by the way, I should note that Russia says we don't want a ceasefire. We want an actual end to the war. We want a peace deal. And so what Russia wants in the peace deal is really what's up in the air right now. And there's different reporting from two different sides. So right now, by the way, Russia, according to Trump, controls about 78% of the Donbass. There is some confirmation on this, by the way, in regard to the narrative widely held in the West. On Tuesday of this week, Dmitry Lavrov told reporters that Russia's view was firm. He says, quote, "I believe American officials have concluded that Russia's position has remained largely unchanged over time and remains within the bounds of its initial," and he uses this word, "maximalist demands." Okay, so that had an impact on my thoughts on this story, because if Russia is unwilling to have a discussion about territory and they're like, we want, we're going all in and we're not going to stop. Well, yeah, it's going to be really difficult to reach a peace deal here. More importantly, Russia wants the peace agreement, not the ceasefire. And a senior administration official said Putin signaled that he was open to discussing some matters that could bridge the divide between the US and Russian positions. But I think at this point, there have been so many meetings with Trump that didn't really amount to much. And Trump has kind of learned a little bit of a lesson in that these talks don't really lead to anything. We have a great meeting. He's very nice. It seems like we're headed in the right direction. And then Putin does the opposite. But according to Jeffrey Sachs, the administration actually is not taking some of Russia's legitimate security concerns seriously, especially when it comes to NATO bases within Ukraine. Take a look.
There are reasons for this conflict. They are fundamentally because Europe and the United States have insisted on NATO being with bases in Ukraine. And that's the reason we have this war. And without solving that problem, there is no solution to this war. In other words, Russia says we have very deep security concerns, which you have neglected or brushed aside. And if we're going to end this war, we need a concept called indivisible security, which is that our security interests, your security interests, Europe's security interests, Ukraine's security interests are on the table, but they're all respected.
So I really respect Jeffrey Sachs. I think that his views on how to accomplish peace, I usually align with, right? And the claim that he's making here, I think is a legitimate claim, Cenk. And if I were Russia, and more importantly, if I were the United States and the Trump administration and I genuinely wanted peace, I would really take that, that ask by the Russians seriously and call their bluff, right? If they're not being serious about how this is all they want, that they're just concerned about their security, at least then we'll know definitively. I don't think we need to have NATO bases in Ukraine if that's what's kind of standing as an obstacle to peace. But the real question is whether you believe that's the real reason why Russia refuses to sit down and negotiate a ceasefire in good faith.
Yeah, it's super tough to tell because not wanting NATO bases right next to Russia, especially in Ukraine, which is very sensitive to the Russians, is a fair ask, is a legitimate issue in this conflict. On the other hand, Putin almost never means what he says. So, we say that about Netanyahu and Israel. It's certainly true of Putin and Russia. And I think, to your point, Anna, Trump realized after the Alaska summit, oh, this guy is playing me, right? Because Putin came around and messed with him and then pretended he was going to get something out of it. And then afterwards didn't deliver on anything, right? And so Trump felt really burned by that. Then Zelensky was going to come over the other day, as he usually does. And Putin called the day before Zelensky came. And at that point, Trump was having a much tougher line on Russia. And then he softened up and started making demands of Ukraine again. So like, Putin keeps saying, oh, just right around the corner, right around the corner. And even I get enticed by it. I'm like, oh, a peace deal, a comprehensive peace deal instead of a ceasefire. Well, that sounds pretty good. Maybe the Russians are open to it now, right? But then he never ever delivers. He constantly is, pulling the football. So yeah, Putin has to actually show actions for him to be believed. Otherwise, it's a fool's errand. But again, don't worry, I have the peace deal when you're ready.
Okay, we'll get to that in just a second. First, I want to correct an error that I've been making in the context of this story, and I really do apologize for this. I guess I'm a Russophobe, or at least it sounds like it, because I kept saying Dmitry when I meant to say Sergey. So it's Sergey Lavrov, not Dmitry Lavrov. I don't know why I have Dmitry on my mind, but it's not Dmitry. Go ahead, Cenk.
Okay. So look, I think the essence of the deal is something along these lines. Are we going to be able to, I greatly sympathize with the Ukrainians. Russia invaded them. They shouldn't have to cede any territory at all. It was an outrageous aggression by Russia, even keeping in mind all the, threats and encroachments that the West did against Russia. Okay, so, but nevertheless, we got to get to peace. So something in the range of 75% of Donbass, they get to keep, because Russia occupies right now about 78%. But in return, NATO is a bridge too far for the Russians. They'll never agree to it. So we do a Qatar-like deal where we give the Ukrainians Article 5 protection without actually putting them in NATO. And then, so where do you negotiate? You negotiate, is it 75% in Donbass? Is it 80%? Is it 100%? Does Article 5 protection mean that US gets to put a base in Ukraine, or no base, or some sort of hybrid off of that? But that's the essential deal that I think can get this thing done. Is that from the outside? Of course. Do I have intricate knowledge of the negotiations? No, guys. I don't claim to be an expert on it. I'm just saying, having covered this story for a long, long time, that's probably where a deal could be made, in that ballpark I'm describing.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I've been kind of avoiding covering Ukraine, like every update, the way that we've been covering what's happening in Israel, is because it's harder to decipher what's really going on with these negotiations, right? I mean, with the negotiations between Israel and Hamas, reading Israeli publications has really been eye-opening and informative, because they do good reporting on it and they're actually honest about what's going on. Here in the United States, there really is this like deeply held anti-Russia sentiment, for good reason in some cases, especially when it comes to a war in which they invaded a sovereign country, full stop. But sometimes I worry that the media is misrepresenting the full picture, or what's actually happening in these negotiations, or the Trump administration isn't being fully transparent about what's happening during these phone conversations. And one other thing I'll say about Trump is that he really kind of yo-yos depending on who he spoke to last. One day he's meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine, and he's musing the possibility of letting them use like long-range missiles so they can do strikes inside Russia. Then he has a conversation with Vladimir Putin over the phone. Next day he has another meeting with Zelensky, and he's like talking him down, dressing him down. It's really interesting, and kind of disastrous.
Yeah, look, for me, I think that I cover Israel more than Ukraine for a couple of reasons. One is, in Ukraine, we're funding the good guys who are trying to protect their territory and their civilians from an invading army. In Israel, we're funding the bad guys who are committing a genocide and taking land from the Palestinians through ethnic cleansing, starvation, etc. And it's one thing to say, look, man, I don't like spending money here and the defense contractors and all that stuff when it comes to Ukraine, and I want to really take care of Americans at home, but at least my heart goes out to the Ukrainians. It's another thing when you say, oh, no, we're not going to take care of people at home. We're going to give it to an invading army who's slaughtering innocent civilians at unprecedented rates, and you're going to be forced to pay for that. And that's just unconscionable. And yes, the civilian death rate in Gaza is worse than any terrorist group in the world. That's the IDF committing terrorism at an unprecedented rate with our money. Ukraine isn't doing that. And lastly, Ukraine doesn't control our politicians or our media. Ukraine is an actual victim. Okay, whereas the Israelis, as we've talked about a lot, have fund 90% of Congress. That 90% votes with them instead of the American people all the time. All of American media covers for Israel. American media doesn't cover for Ukraine, at least as much. There's yeah, we don't get the full Russian perspective here, that's for sure. But overall, there's no like Hasbara, giant amount of pro-Ukraine propaganda in the way that it is overwhelmingly pro-Israel propaganda in the American press. So like, to me, it's apples and oranges. One is a conflict we're involved in because Ukraine's an ally. The other one is a tiny country that controls us in obvious, outrageous ways and makes us pay for a genocide. Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.